A few days ago we got the video for Joel's doing for 2 Timothy. It's Pastor Caleb, and I'll be leading you through the book of 1 John. And it's the other one we were doing for the midweek fill-up, so we'll just be going over an introduction today with the first 4 verses we have. And it reads, "Who is from the beginning, whom we have heard, whom we have seen by our eyes, whom we observe and our hands physically touched concerning the word of life. And the life was revealed, and we have seen, and we witness and report to you the eternal life which was near the Father and was revealed to us. When we have seen and heard, we report also to you, in order that even you yourselves might have fellowship with us, and also our fellowship with the Father and His Son, Jesus Christ. And these things we ourselves are writing, in order that our joy might be having been fulfilled." So this is sort of a interesting and different introduction than you'll find in most of the letters in the New Testament. Again, specifically like what you would have seen in 2 Timothy. John here doesn't begin with his name or who he's writing to or any of that. It just sort of goes right into it. It actually sort of mirrors the book of the Gospel of John in some of the things that it says in the beginning and goes into, and the introduction to their prologues could be considered to be the same. So that's one of the reasons why it seems just so different. But as we go through this, there are certain things we sort of need to introduce and begin to understand in this. The first one is to answer the question of who is the whom, or the who. It starts off with who, but then it goes to whom through the rest of it, so we have to answer the question of who exactly is that referring to. And we can see that the answer is clearly a reference to Jesus. Again, that's the reason why in our translation we decided to capitalize it, because it's making a reference to Jesus and who He was. And because we see throughout the whole thing the whom, it also has the we, whom we saw or whom we physically touched, all those things. We also have to answer the question of who the we is at that same point in time. And again, we can answer that pretty easily as being the apostles. We see that they were the ones who were with Jesus through most of His ministry and saw all the things that He was doing. So we can see that reference in it, that it was the apostles who we see those multiple times as being the we throughout it, and that's important to notice, because it helps lead us into the real important question of who is the author. Again, unlike most of Paul's letters, or even pretty much any other letter with the exception of Hebrews, they all state who the author of the letter is at the very beginning, but this one doesn't, so you have to look a little harder and deeper into it. And from tradition and everything else, we can see that it does appear to be John, the son of Zebedee. Again, from the Gospels, you can find out more of who he is, but it's important that's who it's believed to have been the one who wrote it. Again, you can see the connections with the Gospel of John. Again, he's the one who believed to have written those as well. Again, we can ask the question, who is John of Zebedee? I don't know if you know much about who he is, but again, the Gospels are sort of where we find much of that information. But we also do know that not only was he the author of the Gospel of John, he also authored 2nd and 3rd John, as well as the book of Revelation. So he wrote, I believe, what's word-wise the second most of the New Testament, just behind Luke. And anyways, again, as I mentioned earlier, you can see those connections between 1 John here and the introduction to the Gospel of John as well, that's sort of helps show some of that evidence that he's the one who wrote it. Because again, we believe he's John, the son of Zebedee, is the one who wrote the Gospel of John. As well, we know he was one of Jesus' 3 closest disciples. Typically, it's referred to as Peter, James, and John as being the ones in Jesus' inner circle, or the closest ones that he had. So that's an important note that we make in the midst of this as well, that he was someone who was very close to Jesus. The 3 of them were the only ones who saw the transfiguration, which if you have heard or seen the sermon in 2 Peter 2-3 weeks ago, I believe, Peter, we see in 2 Peter, he refers to the transfiguration, but John would have seen that as well as James, and they were also, the three of them were the only ones to witness, I believe it was the raising of Jairus' daughter. There were certain things that they saw that none of the rest of them saw, and again, it just seems to be a whole reference that much of what's being referred to in this intro is pointing back to what happened in the Gospels themselves. Again, probably specifically the Gospel of John. As well, we know that John was said to be entrusted with Mary, Jesus' mother, that at his crucifixion, Jesus said this very thing. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved, which that disciple whom he loved is typically a reference to how John refers to himself in his gospel, standing nearby, he said to his mother, "Woman, behold your son." And he said to the disciple, "Behold your mother." And from that hour, the disciple took her into his own home. And it does appear that from certain things in church history that it probably continued that way all the way up until her death, that John was taking care of her and looking after her and doing all of those things. As well, we also see John as being a leader with Peter early on in the book of Acts. Again, you'll see that coming up in when we start preaching through that, but Peter and John seem to be the two that are mainly the ones who are leading early on, the ones who are typically being referred to, that at least very early in the church he seemed to become someone who was important, though interestingly both him and Peter sort of get pushed to the side in the book of Acts, and it follows Paul along in much of what it's talking about. And we only have from church history things that happened with Peter and John, but one of them with John is that tradition says that he actually ended up in Ephesus, and it's also believed that Mary was probably there with him at least for a period of time, though she would have been quite older, so she probably would have died at some point. But I think it's believed that she probably ended up there with him as well. So that's another piece of importance that we have to see, that John went to Ephesus, and that's actually where it's believed this book, 2nd and 3rd John, and the Gospel of John are all written probably in or around Ephesus, and to people in or around that area. And as well, even the book of Revelation was written to Ephesus and some of those surrounding churches, though John was probably elsewhere at that point. It does seem that he was likely boiled with oil. Again, we know from the book of Revelation he was exiled to Patmos, and this is sort of one of the most interesting things, is that he died old. He was the only one of the apostles not to be martyred, though frankly it wasn't for lack of trying. Again, they attempted to boil him in oil, so again, they did make some attempts to do some of these things, but it didn't actually happen, and he just ended up dying old instead of being killed like all the other disciples were. So that's just sort of an interesting fact that we can see within that the exile to Patmos, it might have been there that he ended up dying. But anyways, that's just sort of some descriptions of John of Zebedee and who he is. Again, if you want more, you can go and read through all the Gospels and just sort of see pictures of who he is and things that he's doing. So the next question we have to answer is, when was it written? And the easy answer to that is there's probably somewhere around 90 AD, but though frankly it could really be anywhere between 85 and 90 AD, and we sort of know this because it's believed that it was written after the Gospel of John. Again, the connections that go back to it sort of seem to point that it's making references back to it. And the other point is that it was also probably written before the book of Revelation, and the Gospel of John could have been written anywhere between 85 and 90, and Revelation probably 95, 96, 97, maybe a little earlier, but it's probably closer to 95, so it could be anywhere in there that 1st John was written, probably 2nd and 3rd John as well. But the importance to this is that all the rest of the New Testament books were probably written before 70 AD, they believe, because it didn't make reference to the temple destruction, though many of them had predictions towards it. John doesn't really make any mention of that. He seems to be writing later and referring to other issues that were different than the ones that the rest of the apostles were, or the rest of the New Testament writers were dealing with. So there seems to be some significance to that fact that he wrote later and was referring to different sorts of things, which is why his letters seem to be somewhat different than some of the other ones. So as we go through this, we also have to ask, what is the main point of 1 John? What's the point he's trying to make? And I think ultimately the real point he's trying to make is the question of, do you know him? It's an emphasis on the know part. First, because John gives us several tests to see if you truly know God or not. That's what most of the Gospel of John is about. There's different tests in there to see if you really know God and who He is. Because this know isn't just knowing about or anything like that. It goes even deeper and further beyond that to the more intimate knowledge of who He is, and actually knowing Him and being able to spend time with Him, which is oftentimes defined as a relationship with Jesus, because it's, again, that deeper, more intimate knowledge rather than just knowing certain facts about Him. So again, it goes deeper into some of these things, and that's ultimately the point that John's trying to get us to see is, do we know Him? And if we do, then again, we have confidence that we're in Him and are living the way we're called to. And if not, it sort of gives us the way to show how we can know Him and get to know Him better. And that's what we're supposed to be looking through as we go through this. But after giving you a little bit of introduction, we'll go back and sort of look over the text itself, because it's important, these first few verses, because they set things up pretty well. Again, he starts off saying, who was from the beginning, which again is a reference back to actually John 1:1, the Gospel of John, where it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, the Word was God. Again, it's referring Him being from the beginning, or just in the beginning. It's a clear reference back to that, and we can sort of know and understand who it's referring to, but we can see even more as he goes along, where he says, whom we have heard, whom we have seen by our eyes, whom we observed and our hands physically touched concerning the word of life. And the life was revealed, and we have seen, and we witness and report to you the eternal life which was near the Father and was revealed to us. So again, he's sort of describing his whole gospel, summarizing it up in a sense, that obviously they saw and heard and observed all the things that Jesus was doing, and specifically in the resurrection appearances, it even goes to physically touching Him, whether or not it's just referring to Thomas and that whole reference there, or whether it was also referring to some of the other apostles I think may have actually touched Him after His resurrection. I can't remember if John records it or one of the other Gospels, or I'm forgetting it and it wasn't actually there, but it does seem that they probably actually did that. But the whole point that he's still pointing at here is somewhat of a reference there, but it's also just the fact that they were there and observed and know all these things, that they can be trusted in that matter. You'll see more what I mean by that here in a second. But as well, the life and the eternal life specifically are things that John really uses in the Gospel of John as important parts to it. So that's another thing that's important to recognize, is going back to basically what John talked about in his Gospel, and he's sort of re-emphasizing some of those points in what he's writing here, and he wants the people who are receiving this to know and understand that. The other part is that he says, whom we have seen and heard, we report also to you, in order that even you yourselves might have fellowship with us, and also our fellowship with the Father and with His Son, Jesus Christ. And these things we ourselves are writing, in order that our joy might be, having been fulfilled. And the whole idea here is that they didn't just see and observe and got all that information, but they actually reported it to these people as well, that they came and continued to share and spread the gospel with them. Because, again, it's not just something that we take in and know and understand and it ends there. We go and share it with others for them to be able to know it. Again, that's even what we're doing with this video, is getting it out to help encourage those who already know Him, or even to help people understand who He is, who might not know Him yet. And again, John's going to go through and describe how we know whether or not we know Him, and it's all about taking that and sharing it with others as well. So we can ask the question of what is the importance of this? What's the importance of everything we're talking about? And one of the first things is the idea of eyewitnesses. Again, what it means is that they've observed and can confirm what happened. It's not that they just heard stories about it or other people had seen it and they're just reporting it. They themselves actually saw it, and that's why they can report it with confidence and people can trust them because they're the ones who actually saw these things happening. So that's really the importance behind why it mattered that they saw, observed, and touched and all those things, because they were eyewitnesses to these facts. As well, eyewitnesses are important in all cultures, even our own, where a person in a trial, the witnesses are people who are supposed to be eyewitnesses who actually saw the events and can tell what happened. And their testimony is obviously more important than other people's testimonies because, again, they were the ones who seen and observed and all those things. Because, again, that's the most clear representation we can have of what actually happened is people who saw and witnessed it and all of those sorts of things. The other major part of importance here, again, the second half, the first verse 3 and 4, is the sharing and joy. That it should be a joy to share what we've received with others, as I was sort of making out, that we don't just keep it to ourselves, we share it, and that sharing, there should even be a joy within it, which is why they speak about, John speaks about the joy that they have in sharing it. And the very last point here is that the joy of sharing is fully fulfilled when others choose to come to Christ. That obviously there's a joy in sharing it in general, but there's even more fulfillment of that joy when people actually choose to go on and follow it. And that's the thing that we really want to see, is people latching on and choosing to go after it with everything they have. Because that's when the joy can really be fulfilled, because we see people coming to Christ and going back to the point of where all of us should be to begin with in the first place. So again, that's what John is really trying to describe to us here, is that they were eyewitnesses and they saw these things, and there's an importance behind it as well. It should be shared, and there should be a joy that comes with that sharing. So again, we have to come back to the main point, that question that I said is, do you know him? So again, I want to leave you with that question of, do you know him? And again, we'll see whether or not that's true as we go through this, and he gives all those tests that we can see it one way or another. But as well, if not, I want to sort of eventually get you to know that information and know how you can be doing it in the first place. So really just take this time to sort of consider that, of whether or not you truly know him, and then we can see that fully play out as we continue to go on through this series and looking in 1 John and what John is trying to truly teach us through his letter.